Euro Whiteness as a civilizational identity where the other civilization is Islamic civilization. Muslims have been wiped out of the story of modern Europe. Neutrality is a word that is being used a lot as a stick to beat European Muslims up with. There is something about what we are and what they are. Please define what a separatist is. And he said anyone who believes in the Sharia. The nature of a Muslim is that you put God above the state. What binds someone living in Morocco to someone in Malaysia? Well, Islam.
How do you evaluate the media response to Gaza?
So for me, Gaza's all been a lot about the quiet parts allowed. Liberals in this country are far more upset about Brexit than they've ever been about 40,000 people dying in Gaza.
Is the European Union a model for Muslim unity? Can the often fractious and politically weak Muslim world improve its regional strength and international standing by pooling economic and even political sovereignty and creating a zone of prosperity that harnesses the talents and halts a brain drain to the West? Until 1924, the Muslim world came under a caliphate, many calling for a modern unity cite the EU as a model. But is the EU really something to aspire to? What binds the EU states is their unity, which is fracturing under the weight of what my guest today calls Euro Whiteness. Today, many Muslims are being marginalised, not just by the EU nation states, but in a larger sense by an EU that observes itself to be a paradise, protecting its borders from Eastern barbarians, the jungle, as Joseph Borel referred to the outside world. To help us understand the EU, what it is, and what its failings are, I have the pleasure of speaking today to Mehreen Khan. Mehreen is the economics editor of The Times and has spent 5 years with the Financial Times as their Brussels correspondent. Mehreen Khan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to The Thinking Muslim.
Walaikum salam. Thank you so much for having me. I'm a massive fan of the show.
Well, thank you. It's really great to have you on today. And I can't think of anyone better to talk about the EU and what it stands for, because I feel that many Muslims I speak to, especially from around the world, who are looking at Muslim unity or some form of pan-Islamic unity, they cite the EU as an example. So I want to sort of deconstruct, understand what the EU is about today with you. Now, let's start with this idea of Euro Whiteness. I know that you've written a lot and said a lot about Euro Whiteness, and I suppose the EU or European antipathy towards Islam. Just talk a bit about that to me, please.
Yeah, I guess this is us speaking about the reality of what I think European Union politics has become, which is not a politics specific to Europe, but I think it takes on a very specific, no pun intended, colouring. And actually I have to give credit to Hans Kudnani, who is a friend and a colleague who really termed the phrase Euro Whiteness. He wrote an essay about it and then a book, which you should all read, which was out last year, called Euro Whiteness. And Hans diagnoses something that he calls the civilizational turn in European politics, which is from perhaps around 2016, 2017 moment. So the migration crisis in Europe is erupting. There is I think a proliferation of thinking among European countries about what kind of a continent they want to become. And that's very much determined by the fact that they want to close borders or they want to have tighter borders, because the people coming in, particularly during that migration crisis, are brown Arabs from Syria, people from Afghanistan, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, people as far away as Pakistan and India, the economic migrants, but they're all kind of lumped into this bigger non-white category. So this is a moment where in the UK we'll remember this summer very well, because it's the summer of the Brexit referendum, where you have people like the Slovakian Prime Minister calling Muslims cockroaches, Viktor Orban, still the Prime Minister of Hungary, talking about the fact that he doesn't want Muslims in his country, the moving of people through Hungary into Germany to say that they wanted to sort of put this plague onto then considered to be the political enemy, which is Angela Merkel in Germany. So you see a lot of the proliferation of this thinking about migrants as a threat to Europe, not just in terms of the hordes, so the masses, but something ideological is going on, because Islam is often attached to this quite amorphous group of people that are coming from all over the world. They're often men, they seem to be aggressive and rapacious. And then if we fast forward a couple of years, we hear stories about refugees committing crimes in Germany. The whole welcome culture that Merkel instituted then turns very sour. And this is the reality we're now living in 2024, where we don't even pretend to have a welcome culture anymore. So the closed borders element is very much a consensus, and it's true of the right, it's true of the left, it's true of the centre, and it's true of the Greens. There's very few political constituencies or voices in Europe today that will argue for more open borders external open borders policy. Of course, internally, the EU is known for having a more liberalized internal border structure. And Hans calls this Euro Whiteness because he correctly, I think, diagnoses the racial element to this. And what I try and do, taking the concept of Euro Whiteness, is to move it on a level, because I think Islam plays a really, really important role in developing Euro Whiteness as truly a civilizational, paranoia, civilizational pain. Because whiteness, in some senses, is something that Europeans don't really think of themselves as. They often don't really categorize themselves as Caucasian. If you go to Greece, do you ask people if they're white, they'd be like, this is not a category we recognize. But there is something about we now think of it as Judeo-Christian civilization. And I think once you start thinking in terms of what people say when they mean Judeo-Christian civilization, then you have to think about Islam as the other. And this is not something that started in 2016. This arguably started with the foundation of what we think of as Europe, where the first use of the word European, the first instance we have of the word European being used, is actually by Charles Martel, who is battling the Moors, or the hordes of French Muslims coming from then Muslim-dominated Spain, and going in the Battle of Poitiers. And that's when European becomes a term that is used to describe the people that are holding the Muslims back. So Charles Martel is a European rather than just a Carolingian king. And his armies are they're not French at this point, they're Carolingians. And they are fighting Muslims, and they see themselves, and that's the birth of where Europe is. So if we go back to the origins of the term Europe and where it sort of was born through this hostile interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, in this case, Europeans, as they saw themselves, Catholics, essentially. And this is something that I think we can trace throughout the next 1,000 years of European history. That often the other, the scariest, the most outsiderish other is the Muslim other. Because then not only do they represent racially often a different skin tone, they represent a parallel, often conflictual, ideological inheritance about Islam that Europeans have always struggled to bring into their sense of Europe. So there are many examples of this. The one that I like to use a lot is to think about how Muslims have been wiped out of the story of modern Europe, which sort of seems to begin after the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And there is a concerted effort historically to not allow Muslims to be the inheritors of Greco-Roman civilization, because while Europe is in the Dark Ages, Muslims were very much not in the Dark Ages. And by saying that we only had a Renaissance because we were allowed to access Plato and Aristotle through the Arabic translations, once you wipe that intermediary out, you create a version of history which basically starts with Greece, then goes to Rome, then there's this terrible thing in the middle called the Middle Ages and the plague, and then suddenly we have a Renaissance. And so you miss out this whole 300 or 400 year history, which is that the inheritors of that Greco-Roman civilization were actually the Muslims, who then helped create the seeds for the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, etc., etc. So there are many examples of which I think Muslims have been written out of the history of modern Europe. And if we take it all the way into the 20th century, I argue that Euro Whiteness, or whatever we want to call this sticker concept, which includes Islam, is still a litmus test for what it means to be European. Can the concept of European ever be expanded enough to include Muslims who are born in European countries, who know no other country than Europe, who speak European languages, whose children will be born in Europe, and whose generationally are rooted in this continent? Are we ever going to have a version of what it means to be European that includes Muslims? And right now, Muslims are still the litmus test for what it means to be European. We're still kind of outside this schema.
And that's really interesting. And when we talk about the European Union, when theories put together thoughts about the European Union, we always designate the term liberal to European Union. The European Union has moved on. Its religious past, its animosity with the East was a thing of the past. We've now moved into a more secular age where liberalism, or at least a sort of form of neutrality that comes from modern ideology, can embrace all cultures and religions. You sort of suggest that actually a lot of that is still window dressing.
Yeah, neutrality is a super important word, and I'm really glad you used it because it allows me kind of branch into the legal concept of what Europeanness is. And neutrality is a word that has been used a lot as a stick, a legal stick to beat European Muslims up with. Because we go back to 2016, a lot of things happened in that summer. Of course, the Brexit referendum, the migration crisis, but there were also an important judgment from the European Court of Justice, which was asked to rule on 2 cases about women, Muslim women, wearing the hijab in their workplaces. And the court was asked to judge whether it was valid for the employers of said women to ask them to remove the hijab because it wasn't part of their work uniform. And the court decided that the employers were within their right to ask the women to remove their hijabs because the hijab actually violates a concept of neutrality. And neutrality means not having any, they would call conspicuous shows of religious belief. Yeah. And a hijab in the eyes of a judge sitting on a European Court of Justice board is something that is egregious and conspicuous and therefore not neutral. Now, if we use that precedent, which is super important and has been developed in recent years to justify hijab bans all over Europe, if we say, what does neutral mean? Do you have to be white? Do you have to be a Protestant? Do you have to be a Catholic? Do you have to be secular? If your concept of neutrality is based on a certain historicized version of what Europeans have been, then there is no room for Muslims in that. And once you set that legal precedent, and we can talk about how Islamophobia is women of mainly Muslim women who are really face the sharpest edges of institutionalized Islamophobia in Europe. If the hijab is not considered to be a neutral symbol, then where does that leave Muslims in the workplace? Where does that leave them in schools? Where does that leave them in public institutions, as civil servants, as people serving in the police force, just as citizens, if they're considered to be non-neutral? And these are issues that I think Muslims we should be grappling with these things because they are kind of happening in the background as stealth, and they have massive implications for our lived reality in Europe. And again, I think there is a disjunct between how much education there is about these things. So neutrality is a concept that has been used to define Europeanness in a way that is already, I think, excludes basic manifestations of Muslimness, because a hijab is a very basic manifestation of Muslimness. And it is these visible signs of Muslimness that are being, really becoming the litmus test, as I said, for definitions of European.
I said in the introduction that you were the FT Brussels correspondent, and you experience Brussels bureaucrats and its structure firsthand. Like, what was your firsthand experience of what you witnessed of this Euro Whiteness?
So it's so I arrived in 2017, so just after Brexit happened. Well, Brexit was a long-running process, a year after the referendum, where the UK was deciding what it wanted to do. Yeah. And I often found examples of what we now call Euro Whiteness in the weirdest, most parochial, silly things. And one of the first ones I speak about was covering a meeting of the European heads of state. And these things are very boring. They go on for a long time and you're sort of stuck in a room and you're just chatting to people. And an official comes up to me and he tells me this funny story about some sort of leaflets they're producing for the summit. And he said, one of the biggest fights we ever had in the European Council was about the colour of the sort of paraphernalia that we put out on social media or our press releases. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, yeah, so like some countries wanted it to be green and this caused a huge uproar. And I was like, why? He was like, because green is not our colour is blue. And I'm like, well, who's our and who's they and who's we? And he's like, Europe's colour is blue and green is the colour of Islam. Wow. And I was like, wait, what? And then I thought, wait, green is the colour of Islam. Okay. Saudi Arabian flag, Pakistan. The East is been embodied in green, and the blue, as your lovely table here shows, or even here, is what Europeanness is about. And I was like, that is one of the strangest things I've ever seen. But the fact that this is still felt, this self-identification of what Europeanness looks like through the odd things like colours, shows me that there is something way more, I don't want to say sinister, but something deeper going on, that it's just not just about Islamophobia being the fact that we don't like brown people because they're terrorists or because their religion is violent. There is something about what we are and what they are, and those two things are distinct and different, and they manifest themselves in the most silly ways, including what choice you choose to put out your social media tweets about XYZ meeting of heads of state.
I remember a few years back when you were at the FT, there was this incident where you had written an article, I think, about the French and their treatment of Muslims and some of the legislation that was at that time going through their legislative chambers. And the article was taken down, and I think at the behest of the French government, and then Macron penned his own op-ed. Tell me a little bit about that. Like, what happened there?
Yes, so I think it was almost exactly 4 years ago as we're recording, because I know it was almost coincided with the last US election. But this actually, I wrote a piece at what now we would consider to be a very early turn in Macron's government. Yeah. And we now know that this was a turn because it then became the tipping point, which explains a lot about what's happening in France legislatively over the last couple of years. And that's because the French president was in Brussels and he left a meeting early to give a speech, which in itself is not remarkable. And the speech was about separatism. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. He's going to give a speech about like why the Corsicans want to secede from the French state. These are like the, annoying sort of parts of like the weird French state. You have some people that want to secede from the state. But actually he attached the notion of separatism to Muslims. And I thought, wow, okay, so there was this move from this liberal, modern, young president who, when he was first elected, was more open to the ideas of Muslims becoming an integral part of France. And then 3 years later, because of terrorist attacks and Charlie Hebdo and the murder of Samuel Paty, a teacher in France, you saw this clear shift from Macron, which was then 2 years before an election, so it's 2020, and in 2022 there's a presidential election. And I thought, okay, he's doing the classic thing of like finding the Muslim enemy and actually creating this entire new separate definition of a crime, something called separatism, that Muslims in France are going to be accused of. And the difficulty with this accusation is very hard to say that you're not a separatist. It's hard to falsify the fact that you're not guilty of this crime. And I noticed this because when I wrote the piece, and lots of French diplomats were quite angry, one of them called me up and he said, I said to him, Ambassador or Mr. Diplomat, I was very polite. I said, please define what a separatist is to me, right? And he said, anyone who believes in the Sharia. And I said, well, you have deliberately cast a net which includes every single person who identifies as a Muslim. He said, and then when I knew that the net was that wide, I was like, okay, so this is a very broad degree of like pseudo-criminal activity that Muslims are going to be accused of, because the nature of a Muslim is that you put God above the state. The nature of being a religious person is you put God above the state. And Macron was saying this is not acceptable. And so I wrote a piece before there was any legislation that's saying that if you cast this net this wide, you are capturing the entirety of Muslimness in France rather than what you want to capture, which I think is violence, real criminality, what you would define as real extremism. And what your government ministers are talking about is halal food, the hijab, polygamy, shisha lounges. And this all sounded to me just like Muslimness. And you claim that you want to attack Islamism, but if your definition just means Muslim, then we have a problem. So the piece was written, I think it was up for about 5 or 6 hours. It was up long enough for people to call me up to tell me they didn't like it, which in and of itself is how the process should work, right? You read the piece, you don't like it, and you complain. That's fine. It was taken down at the behest of the editor. I cannot tell you whether she was put under pressure by the French government. All I know is the French government was very, very angry about it. And they were angry enough that the president then wrote a riposte to my piece, which no longer existed, on the FT's website, where sadly he indulged in exactly the same kind of dog whistling and criminalization of Muslims that is so common in France, and went unchallenged. So he made a series of claims in that piece, including this idea that Muslim children from the age of 3 or 4 are taught to hate the values of the Republic. This is a bit like when I hear American or Israeli politicians say that Palestinians are taught to hate us from a young age, that they are inculcated in the values that are anti-Republic, anti-French, or anti-American or anti-Israeli. These are very, very dangerous claims. They are part of a dehumanization process. And sadly, like that entire experience showed to me that, calling out what is just overt Islamophobia, which is done for political reasons as it was done for that Macron government, seems to be still beyond the pale. There is a certain degree to which people who, because they are liberal or progressive or pro-European, accusing them of racism is a stick too far. And a bit like the old meme, the accusation of racism seems to be worse than the racism itself.
In that piece, you mentioned something like that we don't need a government writ to make Islam French or British or German. Do you feel that these European governments are trying to establish, I suppose, a national form of Islam? Explain that to me.
Yeah. So the instinct after the things like terrorist attacks, often in countries where the state is big and present, like France and Belgium, where I was based, is that, okay, so there's all these, what they think of as aberrant forms of Islam. So what we need to do is create Belgian Islam or French Islam. So that means we'll set up an institute called the French Institute for Islam, yes, where we will have state trained or certified imams, and we will have a certain version of Islam which says if you are Muslim, you put the state before God. These are highly questionable things. I'm not endorsing them, but this is the way that you're thinking about it. Yes. You believe that laicite or secularism is a value that is more important than whatever your religion may tell you. And you have to denounce all of these things and you have to endorse all of these things to make France compatible with the values of the Republic. And this is a genuine thing. So there were talks about how to find the money for these projects. France right now, I think of January 1, 2024, is only having French instituted or French certified imams in French mosques. And so because the state is so big in France, the state can achieve a lot. There is a centralization, there's a centralizing instinct that is then applied as it is to the health service or to transport or to defense. Well, of course, we can just do this with religion. And for me, this is patently ridiculous, not just because I'm Muslim, but probably also because I'm British. And I'm like, this is not how religion works. You cannot create by fiat whatever institutionalized religion you want. And it also reminded me in much more sinister circumstances the way the French and other colonial powers behaved when they were colonial rulers over Muslim countries, where they had colonially approved versions of Islam or colonially certified imams and mosques who they would then go out to use to control and coerce populations.
Yeah, and sorry to dwell on this article, but I think it was a fascinating piece in the title.
You can still read it, by the way, because nothing can ever be deleted from the internet.
Right. No, so I found it the other day when I Googled it, and the title was France's Dangerous Religion of Secularism. So that was quite a courageous phrasing, I suppose.
I think that wasn't the initial FT article. I think that might have been somebody else's version of it, but ultimately that was what I was saying.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. And so what makes secularism a religion in France?
The one thing that I've already just sort of said, and I think I made an unceremonious comparison between Macron and someone like the Taliban, which obviously would have annoyed all the right people,
That's right,
I think.
yeah.
But the idea that you use the state as an instrument of control to have mandated and approved forms of religion and clearly non-approved versions of religion. This is what we see as the centralizing instinct of some of the worst parts of what I think Islamism has become. This idea that this is correct, this is not correct, and we prosecute you. And I guess it's really important for the listeners to understand that secularism probably doesn't capture what the French mean when they say laïcité. It is very historically specific, and I think it's very historically contingent on the French state's relationship with the super powerful Catholic Church at the turn of the century. And this process by which they defanged the Catholic Church, they robbed it of its wealth. They often removed the cassocks off the priests so that the clothing was a massive part of how to assert the identity of the secular French state against the most powerful religion of the day, which is Catholicism. And my argument has always been is that laïcité is all well and good, but it was about a power struggle between a very powerful institutional religion and a very powerful state. In France today, you have a very powerful state, and the people that are the subject or the victims of the laïcité crusade, let's call it that, are disempowered, often weak, not politically represented, low socially mobile, low income groups of people, which are French Muslims, who are discriminated against in the labor market. They're discriminated against when they want housing. They're discriminated against in schools. They're discriminated against socially and racially. This is not a powerful institutional religion that you're fighting. It's a bunch of millions of Muslim people who are disparate, scattered across the country, and often form the lowest rungs of society. Now, do you want to use the full force of the state, as you did against the Catholic Church, on these people? It makes no sense to me as a power struggle. And I know that you're political scientists and power is super important to understand conflict. And that's when I tell people in France, and nobody really likes to hear this, but you have to understand the concept of laïcité. How do you apply it in a multiracial, multi-religious, post-colonial, 21st century country that is France? This is not the 19th century. It's not the 20th century. This is not about a rich Catholic Church. This is about people that have almost no real sense of mobilized political power. And the asymmetry is so stark to me that I find it ridiculous that we talk about the laïcité principle as it applied in the early 20th century, as it should apply in the 21st century. Muslims should not be weaponized against Muslims. It's not for them. It wasn't designed for them.
Brilliant. So let's talk about the EU as a model. As I said at the very beginning, there are some in the Muslim world who see the parlor state in the Muslim world and the disintegration of many of the states and the weakness of their economies, the brain drain from Pakistan, Bangladesh, India to Western states, Nigeria, African countries. And the feeling is that we need some form of Muslim unity. Mm-hmm. And often the EU is cited as a model. I think we've had speakers on my platform that cited the EU as a model for Muslim unity. Before we talk about the model bit, let's just talk about what the EU is and what it is. It's like, you're someone who's very knowledgeable about the EU and its institutions. Just give us a basic appraisal and a basic understanding of what the EU is.
Yes. It's difficult to ascribe a certain identity to what the EU is in political science terms as a unit of analysis, because it's very much a mishmash of stuff. Yeah. But if we just think about it historically, the European Union is a post-war political project which has elements of supranationalism, so the creation of authorities, primarily a system of law that exists above its constituent member states, but those member states also have a lot of powers that we know nation states have, like taxing people and spending money as they decide to do. So it's a strange halfway house between supranational body that has a lot of federal powers, and then some that where it is almost absent. And at a very basic level, there are 27 countries that are called member states inside the European Union. Then you have these, I guess, institutions of the European Union themselves, which is the European Commission, often known as an executive, and a European Parliament, which was created a little bit later on in the 70s as a kind of democratic wing to sort of legitimize the whole thing, because obviously we need people to vote and we need them to feel like there is some democratic model to this. And there's often a hierarchy with these institutions, but often it's the member states who call themselves the Council of Europe or the European Council. Then you probably put the Commission under there, which has the power to propose legislation. And then I think the Parliament is probably the weakest part of that. Its job is to also has part in the legislative process, so it approves legislation, but it doesn't have the power to initiate. And I guess most people in this country knew about the European Union probably on July the 26th, 2016, when we decided we no longer wanted to be part of it. And there were many reasons for that. So I guess the other extreme of a supranational body that perhaps more people are aware of is the United States. And in some sense, the United States is the complete version of what the European Union should be. So in the kind of Pokemon evolution world, and maybe the European Union is like the Pikachu, and the middle stage is the United States, and then who knows what the last stage is. But that's where you have a strong federal central government, and you have states, 50 of them. And actually, the central government has much more fiscal and financial power to decide to raise taxes on behalf of all of the states and to do spending on behalf of all of the states. Whereas, say, Hungary and Poland, for example, or Sweden and Denmark, they are opting in and out of different parts of the European Union as they wish. And then I should probably ask one final clarification is that within the European Union, there's an even smaller, more concentrated and integrated body of the Eurozone. And these are the now 20 countries that actually share a currency between themselves, which means they share a central bank. They all use the euro. So when you go on holiday there, you don't need to change your money. And that's, I guess, a more integrated version of the European Union, a more kind of concentric circle where these countries are tied by the fact that they have a common currency, which means they have a common monetary policy.
I mean, a common perception of the EU is that it is an economic union and it brings together. And so I suppose there is an appeal to it in the Muslim world where economically, at least, many of these states are stultering and are not progressing as well as they should be. Is there an ideological component to the EU?
Yes. I mean, it's very difficult to think of the EU, and as many people I think are tempted to do, as purely a technocratic project, because the technocrats are driven by a certain vision or ideal of what they would like. And this began in the 1940s and the 1950s with the coal and steel union. So you would have a couple of countries, only 6 of the founding member states decided that when it came to coal and steel, they were going to be a common union. This has now been expanded to what we call the single market as a whole. So inside the European Union, you have a single market where goods cross borders freely. You have a customs union, which means all of those countries, when you do trade deal with another country, they imply a common tariff. Now, to keep this whole thing together, you need lots and lots and lots of law, lots of regulations, lots of common rules, and everyone has to agree to them. But let's go back to the ideology. Why would you want to create a single market? Why would you want to create a liberalized unit of economic unit like a single market? Why would you want to have a customs union? It's basically based on a very rudimentary neoliberal idea about how to create prosperity and growth through lower regulations, through the free movement of people, through the free movement of capital. And it's a bit odd because often when you think about the European Union, you think about people that opposed it. Thatcher is one that comes to mind. And Thatcher is a traditionally very right-wing figure inside the European Union. But what Thatcher did was that she was opposed to lots of the political integration, which she was uncomfortable as a sovereigntist. She didn't want to give away so much. But she said, if I'm going to give it away, then I want an economic project that looks a lot like the economic project I'm trying to create at home. And that is about, for her, it was about lowering wages through creations of mobile labor markets. If you're in Spain and you have an economic crisis, you can go to Germany, and then even if you've got a PhD, you work as a waiter in Germany because that's how it's supposed to work. This kind of economics balancing structure. And it is neoliberal, and it's worth pointing out that when the UK decided to join, for example, in the 70s, we had a referendum in this country, and it was people on the left that were the Eurosceptics of the day. Because as people of the left, they wanted things like higher workers' protection. They didn't want massive liberalization, a race to the bottom regulation. They thought the single market would be bad for workers and good for capital. people like Tony Benn were some of the most eloquent leftist Eurosceptics. So there is an ideological component, and the ideological battle was one in which I think the right-leaning neoliberals and centrists won, and that's why we have the single market the way it's constructed. That's why we have the trade sort of arrangements as they are constructed. And importantly, things like Thatcher and the struggle on the left, and Christopher Bickerton, who I think is one of the best political analyzers of the European Union. Everyone should read his little book called Short Introduction to the European Union. It's a Penguin book. He describes the things like, in the UK, we were really struggling to have workers' rights implemented in UK law. And often the left saw the European Union as a way to get these things done through the back door. So there's always been ideology involved. And that is still true to this day. I talk about the European Parliament, where there's a left party, there's a centre-left party, there's a right party, there's a far-right party, there are liberals, and they all kind of contest amongst each other about what they think the European Union should be. But I think with a very limited scope, where nobody really questions the viability of the project as such, they're just sort of quibbling about what kind of regulations they want. So it's very difficult to take politics and big ideology out of the European Union, which was created at a post-war era where the triumph of neoliberalism, so we're talking about the 80s really with Thatcher and Reagan, was supreme. And in many ways, the modern European Union encapsulates the triumph of those values, which is why people on the left to this day still have really gripes about the operation of the European Union.
But it's interesting, the Labour Party, for example, here in the UK, although they didn't explicitly come out in favour of the EU, I know that Corbyn has historically been very sceptical of the EU, but at least much on the Labour left, many on the Labour left were very pro-EU and were calling for a reversal of Brexit. So why the change? Why do the left today have far more of a wide embrace of the EU than they did have back in the 70s during Benn and Lise?
That's a really, really good question. And it's also helps us tell the story of what's happened to the modern left in this country, probably in the 90s, definitely with the New Labour era. So we have a move into the centre, a move into favouring technocracy and bureaucracy over policies. And this other weird thing that happens, which I've always grappled with, which is that being progressive became something that is attached to the European Union. So it became, to say that you're progressive, why exactly? Is there anything really in the way the European Union operates that would mean that as a person who is progressive or on the left, socially or culturally, you would attach yourself to the European Union? So there's a really kind of shallow version of cosmopolitanism that I would say that the European Union is held up as. Because you have 27 people from 27 different countries all living in this political bloc in harmony, that shows a degree of cosmopolitanism. That is the destruction of nationalism, of throwing away the shackles of your national identity and identifying yourself with something that is Europe. So maybe on the shallow level, if you're progressive, you're saying, oh, that's good. This looks like the more, hate to say it, even multicultural version of Europe that me as somebody on the left or whoever you are would be attracted to. So there's that. And we can pick that apart because I think there's so many holes in what I've just said there. And we can go back to Euro Whiteness as a reason why that's not true. And then there's the sense in which, because the left or social democrats of Europe, which is people like the Labour Party in the UK, the SPD in Germany, PASOK in Greece, left parties, and the new left, the third way left of the 90s was one that embraced the market. It embraced market structures, it embraced free market capitalism, it embraced things like free movement of labour. It also embraced, and this often meant high degrees of migration because people are moving around all the time. And it also, something I haven't mentioned at all already, is the role that central banks play in creating economic prosperity. So the role of the government is not so much to decide the economy because we've privatized everything, that fiscal policy plays a role, but globalization means that governments are not that powerful anymore. So we gave a lot of the power, technocratic power, to our central banks. There's one right behind us right now, the Bank of England. And their job is actually to fine-tune the economy and to create prosperity. So there's a lot of delegation being done here. Globalization means that we can't really control a lot of the bigger things like migration. The central monetary policy means that we have to give that power back to control inflation to the central banks. And our jobs as governments is just to kind of fine-tune and to produce, enough of the right taxes and enough of the right spending to create prosperity. So there is an ideological hollowing out of the left, which means that it becomes perfect for the modern European Union to absolve. And that's why the left or left Euroscepticism really dies out from the 90s and the 2000s onwards. And you mentioned Corbyn, who's very much a relic of an older left, who now is a bit of a historical anomaly because he represents a completely different left tradition, which always saw the dominance of capital that the single market represented as something that would hurt workers.
the EU is this ideological bloc, but of course many in the Muslim world hate it as some sort of economic success story. So is the European Union as successful that many see it as?
That's a really, really big question. And it depends in which part of Europe you're standing. Right. So if I was in Poland in the early 90s, thinking about what the post-communist Poland looked like, a post-communist state, these countries, and it just includes Central Eastern Europe, I'm going to make a broad kind of characterization. When these countries fell out of the communist bloc, they had to undergo incredibly painful forms of liberalization, which is huge amounts of deflation in the country. So the cutting of workers' wages, the idea that they had to be part of the market economy, which meant letting companies come in and invest and therefore set their own standards about what they wanted to do. But ultimately, that very painful process meant that they were eligible to join the European Union. Then once they became part of the single market, you do see metrics like just GDP per capita really shooting up in these countries. So there is a process by which very, very poor countries were forced to converge to the richer ones, and that gap between the poor and the rich does narrow. That's true. But what if you're a really rich country, one of the founding member states, either Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, these are the founding member states of the European Union, this convergence process has stopped because they've stopped getting richer, and the ones that were catching up with them have done a lot of the catch-up growth, and so there's a narrowness of it. But is France getting richer? Is it performing economically better than Germany or other countries? No, and there's many reasons why, but maybe there is a diminishing returns to the membership of the European Union. There is incompleteness about the single market. So we've got to a place where we have a single market of goods, but you can't really sell services across the European Union. There's no real common banking system across the European Union. You know that if you've lived in Belgium and you want to go to France, you have to get a new bank account. You know, there are all these kind of frictions that still exist. So that is why it's a half-complete political project. But I think for Muslims, and I'm going to just, really just confine myself to the secular analysis of what I think the European Union is and what Muslims, what they would like to do. They can take their own lessons from it. Yeah. But I can see the appeal as a poor Muslim nation, understanding that there are very other rich Muslim nations, and you want a piece of that pie, or you want to be able to share in that level of prosperity, and maybe creating a structure where you're bound to these countries to some degree is a way to create a convergence process within the Muslim world. Now, these things all happen over time and they're very, very complicated, but I can definitely see the superficial appeal of being a poorer Muslim state and thinking, well, we need to converge to the level of the UAE, or we need to converge to the levels of Saudi Arabia or Indonesia or Malaysia or slightly more wealthier countries, or even Turkey. And maybe we need to do that through the creation of these market structures. I will also warn, though, there's no free lunch, of course. This is economics we're talking about. The countries I've just mentioned that converged, they have suffered massively in terms of brain drain. So once you're part of this union where there is single movement of labor, if you're in a poor country where you're earning $5 a day for the plumbing that you do, but you can move to Germany and earn $50 a day for the same work, you're going to do that. So there are many, many consequences for being bound into these types of structures.
That's very true. I mean, I suppose the thing to say about the European Union, because you mentioned the European Union is not a federal structure, a federal organization, although there are many people within the EU that would like it to be more federalized and become more like the United States. Maybe one of the things that inhibit that federalization is just the fact that these nation states are very proud and substantial nation states, whereas in the Muslim world, I mean, the history of nation states is far less of a feature. And many of the Muslims do see themselves, ideologically at least, to have lots of commonality. So maybe the European Union has failed in Europe because of the strength of the nation state. But in the Muslim world, where there are more commonalities, a structure like that would actually work far more favorably, far more in their favor. I mean, how would you answer that?
That's a very good point, and they're very. So let's do a kind of exercise in the pros and cons of why European Union works and it doesn't work, and why the merits of what Muslims have and the things that they lack. Yeah. So let's go to this point about what binds us as an ummah. Yeah. So what binds someone who lives in Finland with someone who lives in Portugal? Not the weather, not the food, not the language, not even the religion, not even a common history in terms of, fighting wars and thinking of yourself. The thing that binds a Portuguese person and a Finnish person is that they're part of a structure or a contiguous geographical body called Europe, and they're both members of this political institution called the European Union. But that's a pretty shallow level of unity. But what binds someone living in Morocco to someone in Malaysia? Well, Islam, and often Sunni Islam, if we're going to even narrow it down. And I think for a secular person listening to this, they were like, well, what does that mean? Actually, it means a lot. We know it means a lot because we feel it. We all feel it. We feel it when we're in these countries. The fact that Islam binds us is something that is very, very strong. And stronger, I would say, than the ties that binds a Finnish person to a Portuguese person, which I think in this cultural sense of what it means, of commonality and unity, is weak in that sense. So that in that sense, we have something going for us. Then what do we not what does the European Union really have going for it that we don't? I think one is this really important factor of the geographical contiguity of the continent. So we take Britain and Ireland, we are islands as such, but we were geographically part of the same sort of space. We inhabit the same time zones, etc. And that kind of seamlessness of borders is really important to making the economics of it work. It does mean that people can hop over borders. It means that you can go get a job, drive in a car, and that makes Europe feel close, even if you're in Portugal and you drive to Germany. Can you do that between a North African state and a Gulf state? No, there's a big geographical gap. So to make the economics work, there is a certain inescapable geography that we will have to kind of ameliorate, and it's hard to think of how that does get ameliorated. So they have that. Then there's the other sense in which I think these European countries are bound by a common trauma, and that you have to go back to the First and the Second World Wars, and the idea that nationalism was the thing that created those wars, and if we want to quell that violent seed, then there is a degree to which we have to supersede this nationalism. And that is still felt in Portugal and Finland, who were, still thinking about the similar common threats, be it through fascism of different forms. So they have a unique kind of trauma or inherited trauma of the post-war era that they have. Muslim countries, our history is a little bit different. Our relationships, let's be honest, I guess the real touch point for our common history is the Ottomans, and how various Muslim, now call them nations, their relationship with the dissolution of that empire, some of whom it was a completely traumatic event, and for others it was a massive liberation. So we have less of that common history to deal on, because our picture is much more mixed in the 19th and 20th centuries. And then I guess I think the thing that you really touched on is the really good point that as Muslims, we are still a little bit uncomfortable with thinking of ourselves as nations or separate nations. We might think of ourselves as tribes even, but it's much more to say that the thing that really, the identity I hold most close to me is the fact that I'm Pakistani. I know that's true for a lot of people, but ultimately we know that even that is a very new notion. Before 1947, no one would have said that the thing that they care most about is the fact that they're Pakistani. So we have this different kind of relationship with the nation state. And that's why I think, and it's worth bringing the US into this example, because if we want to think about the ultimate flexibility of an identity where sovereignty can be both shared but also closely held, the US is the most complete federal example of it. And I say that because the US's relationship with the state, or Americans, the way that they feel about the state, is perhaps slightly closer to the way that Muslims would be more comfortable with. So I've spoken about countries where the state is super important. France is one of them, where there is a long reach of the state into your behavior, into controlling what you do, into criminalizing you, or saying this is the constitution, this is what you should do. And I think Muslims, traditionally, our political history is that we've had a much more flexible relationship with these types of authority. And you see this in America, of course. And there's an argument that the reason Muslims might flourish more in America because it's much more of a political system that is conducive to how Islam thinks about the state than they do in Europe, where the state very much is the policeman. It is, it is the big brother, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe that's more of a relevant example. And you're probably going to tell me all the reasons why you think the US is not an appropriate example. But I think in terms of just that relationship of what it means to be a citizen in a country where you have a state, so Tunisia, but you're also the citizen of a broader federal authority, the United States, or in this case, the new caliphate, I think they make it work more because their states are less present in their lives. And any kind of future Muslim unity or body or political structure would have to have this relationship where you do not feel the strong hand of that federal authority that much. Because I think that offends lots of people's sense of Muslimness, the idea that you're getting policed as a citizen. So there are pros and cons to these things, but I think the EU's common shared political trauma of the 20th century and the fact that it's a geographically contiguous body things that it really has going in its favour. And these are the things that really keep the European Union together, despite all the incredible challenges that we've been speaking about.
Yeah, the idea of Euro Whiteness fit into this. I mean, if the European Union states, you gave the example of Portugal and Finland and how, these are disparate people and they have very little in common. How much is this an overt project to bind European citizens together in a way defining them against a threat from the East, a threat from Islam?
Yeah, this is the kind of negative identity point. And I think negative identity does a lot more work in Europe than positive identity. And my argument is that part of the negative identity is the way that you define what being European is by making a definition of what European is not. And the contiguous geographical body thing is really important because what's not in Europe? North Africa. Actually, Morocco and Spain are closer to each other than Spain is to Germany, right? Geographically, this is just a hop. There isn't no distance there. But why can Morocco never be considered part of Europe? We know why. It's a Muslim state. This has clearly been on show throughout the early 2000s with the very, very painful talks about whether Turkey should be part of the European Union, and a clear rejection from then Angela Merkel Chancellor, Nicolas Sarkozy, French president, who just said the quiet part aloud, and they said, we can't do it. It's a Muslim country. There are currently very long conversations about Albania becoming an accession country to the European Union. Let's be honest, Ukraine is going to get there before Albania. Why is Albania not going to get there? Because it's a Muslim majority country. So as soon as you start thinking about expanding the actual political union that is the European Union to other countries, Muslimness becomes perhaps the most crucial variable in determining whether or not they've got a chance or not. And this is important because the European Union has managed to actually expand its definition of Europe to other religions. And the one that is most important is Orthodox Christianity. Now, Orthodox Christianity was always considered to be a kind of exotic Eastern branch of Christianity that wasn't really Christianity for Protestants and Catholics. They thought these guys were some kind of weird relic of hybrid sort of form of religiosity that real Christians, like the Orthodox people, were not considered to be European. But we have managed to expand the definition of Europeanness to Orthodox Christianity. And now I'm arguing that it will never really be able to truly accommodate Islam in that definition. That's where Euro Whiteness comes in for me. I guess we're talking about whiteness, but I want to expand it from race. I'm not just talking about race here. I'm really talking about Euro Whiteness as a civilizational identity where the other civilization is Islamic civilization. And that also helps explain to us why Europe doesn't just have a problem with Turkey or Morocco. It has a problem with the Muslims inside Europe, the European Muslims, because we are somehow still seen to be part of a different civilization. And how many generations do we have to go through? How many generations of Muslims have to be born in Europe for us to actually be considered European? And I don't know the answer to that yet.
But does this civilizational turn, this Euro Whiteness, have anything to do with what we've seen from the European Union in the last year over Gaza? We've just seen statement after statement by Ursula von der Leyen, which has actually been even far stronger and strident against the Palestinians than maybe some of the American politicians have been. Have had to strike a slightly more moderate tone. What accounts for this hypocrisy almost, where it certainly is hypocrisy over Gaza?
So I think, ironically, the reason that the European Union has been so cack-handed about the Gaza issue is because it's descended back into their nationalisms. So everything we've talking about, this idea of construing a European identity, of feeling European, actually, when it comes down to the crux of many issues, the Pavlovian response of people is based on their nationality. So you mentioned Ursula von der Leyen. I would argue that Ursula von der Leyen acts the way she does about Israel because she's German. It has absolutely nothing to do with her as a European Commission president or the fact that she's representing Europe, because she's not. She's doing it because those are her German instincts. Her German instinct meant you jump on a plane, you go to Israel after October the 7th, and you do, glad handing with Israeli political leaders, and you claim to be doing it on behalf of the European Union, but you're doing it because you're German. And we know this because Ireland, Spain, Belgium, these are traditional countries that have always had slightly stronger pro-Palestinian constituencies, are now acting in ways that break away from the way the German Commission president wants to talk about Palestine or Gaza, or how the entire German political establishment, the Nordics, were never really been that invested in these issues. And the countries that care the most because of their national inheritances or their own experiences of colonialism, in the cases of Ireland or Spain, and their historical ties to parts of the Middle East. So they're actually behaving just as countries again. That's why it's a mess. That's why, you mentioned Joseph Borel at the beginning. I would arguably say he's the only person that's come out of this entire diplomatic shambles with any sort of credit because he's Spanish. Right. So in that sense, there are so many levels of, in which you have to diagnose why people say the way they do. And often it's their nationality that you just come back to as the thing that is driving their approaches to foreign policy.
Fascinating. I never thought of it like that. Actually, on the Gaza issue, you're a journalist, you work for a mainstream paper. We've had independent journalists on this program for some time, and they've all decried how the mainstream press have almost silenced or have a view towards Gaza, which is whitewashing this genocide of this slaughter. You're someone who still works within the mainstream press, and how do you evaluate the media response to Gaza?
I think the last year has been really important. So when I had my little scuffle with Macron, which, to be honest, in hindsight was pretty great, it exposed to me some of the things that I thought about the media that were no longer true. I was like, 9/11 was a long time ago. Maybe we've learned something about how to write about Muslims, because when you hire Muslims, hopefully that changes the way that you provide a more nuanced coverage, or at least the lenses through which you report to your readers is less, not prejudiced, but just ignorant. And I think that Macron moment exposed to me that basically very little progress has been made. And a lot of the diversity thing is just a visage. It's just a way to say that we're doing right things without substantive cultural change in newspapers. And then with Gaza, this thing has just been accelerated by 100x. The fact that, yes, Western journalists can't get into Gaza, we should be complaining about this every single day. On every single front page of every newspaper, we should have a hole in the story that should have been from Gaza, but we're not allowed to go to Gaza. So we should say that this is why there is a blankness in our coverage, right? This is not a murder. This has been forced by the fact that we can't get access to these places. And if we are telling our readers up front in a transparent way that we can't tell you what's going on in Gaza because we're not allowed to go into Gaza because the Israeli authorities that control the region will not let Western journalists in for us to do our reporting, that in itself will be such a powerful message to actually show some transparency about our coverage, right? Why is that not happening? I don't think it's a particularly controversial thing to do. I think many newspapers would do this. We are campaigning. Many newspapers campaign. They have campaigns to say, we want to bring back a journalist who's been arrested by Putin or is been captured by a foreign government. We create campaigns for things that we think are important that people should care about. Why can't Western journalists have any mobilization to really bring this to light? And I know it has been happening. It has been happening at individual levels, particularly journalists in Britain who've signed petitions and put campaigns out there. But we should just be more honest with our readers. We can't tell you what's going on. We don't know. Instead of just saying, here's all of our reporting about what's going on in Israel right now. Here's how Israel is behaving internally. Here's the protests that are going on inside Israel. Here's what Netanyahu said. Here's what this ministry said. Here's how the US has responded. So we have this incredibly one-sided version of coverage because we just can't get people to do the boots on the ground. Why are we not condemning the fact that Gaza has been the most bloodiest, most clearly the most bloody episode for any journalism in the world, the number of journalists that have been killed? This is it's a profession where there is this sense of unity that you have with other journalists because we understand the risks that you go through. But all of a sudden, that kind of unity falls away. And so for me, Gaza has all been a lot about the quiet parts aloud, right? And we know this because when there were refugees from terrible conflict in Ukraine, they are welcomed. When they come from Syria, Afghanistan, we're told that there's no place for these people. The immediate reaction to what was happening in Gaza were often like, oh, I hope this doesn't create another refugee crisis because that would be really politically inconvenient for everyone having to fight an election in 2024. These are the instincts of the people that run the media and our politicians. And it shows me that, I became a journalist not because I looked at this industry and thought, wow, this is a super amazing fourth estate and I would love to be part of holding power to account. No, I grew up in 9/11 in the UK and I saw the incredibly poisonous narratives that were created around Muslims, refugees, asylum seekers in this country by newspapers. And I realized that these people, these institutions have a massive role to play in the way that we think about the world. And sadly, once you're inside those institutions, you realize that 20 years on from 9/11, really has that much changed? Does representation really change that much? We can try, but it's really difficult. And a lot of people decry the fact that people don't read newspapers anymore. I'm not crying too many tears about that. I think you should all read the economics pages of the Times, but otherwise, the market has responded. Let's put it that way.
One last question for you. Across Europe, we've got the rise of Islamophobic parties, and it seems like these far-right parties are attaching themselves very radically to this Euro Whiteness idea, or at least to this cultural superiority that we thought had disappeared from Euros. Many parties are winning elections based on sort of anti-Islamic ticket. Even here in Britain, you've got Kemi Badenoch, now the leader of the Conservative Party, and she has record suggesting that things about Muslims which are quite outrageous. And as I would imagine, I would suggest that even the Labour Party has not come out strongly against Islamophobia as it would have, say, 20 or 30 years ago, because I suppose there may be a currency in the wider public, or at least there's a base there that they need to appeal to. Like, what prospects do you see for Muslims across Europe, Britain, across Europe, with the rise of this right?
So you've identified a lot of things. One is the right and how it's kind of infected the centre and the people who would consider themselves not to be on the right. And often, we all make political choices about who we want to sort of target with our advocacy. And with me, I've always kind of gone for the liberals, right? Because with the right, and we will all experience this, there's a degree of honesty, completely shameless, of course, about what they say about Muslims and how they feel about Islam and their civilization. But there's a degree to which you understand what you're dealing with, you understand the way that they make your argumentation. It's that centre that I have always been somebody that I'm more interested in understanding what happens there, right? So, I mean, Nasreen Malik, who writes for The Guardian, who I think is one of the most incredible kind of political voices we have in this country, or writing in English about these issues, has diagnosed this really well, that when there's low-level Islamophobia going on, so when Boris Johnson talks about people, when ladies wearing the burqa, or the European Union is banning the hijab in workplaces, etc., there's a kind of liberal shrug. And they're like, we've got other things to worry about, like Brexit. Liberals in this country are far more upset about Brexit than they've ever been about 40,000 people dying in Gaza. I'll just leave that with you, right? The level of emotional angst that they've carried towards that rupture is more than they could ever muster for genocidal activities in other parts of the world. So those are political choices. But then the riots happen in the UK, and then all of a sudden all the good people, the liberals, come out and say, oh, we need to defend our communities, and we need to... It gets to the point of an absolute extreme where the good people, your allies, then they suddenly emerge and they want to show you solidarity, and they all want to say, I'm so sorry about what's happening. Are you and your family okay? And I'm like, where were you before? Where were you before the 10, 15, 20 steps that we took to the point that then you actually have riots in this country because people also feel so much racial anxiety about Muslims? And I think, so you asked me about what do I feel about the prospects of Muslims. I'm actually really optimistic about the prospects of Muslims. Possibly because I feel like it's almost an obligation on my face to have a degree of optimism about despite all the challenges we go through, I feel like there is a moral incumbency to think that there is good. I think what Muslims are undergoing is a evolution in the racism that is being attached to us. And I guess in the 80s or before, the racism that my parents had to undergo, my grandparents, is that they were newcomers in a country that didn't understand them and didn't know anything about them, and so we were aliens, right? And now we attracted the kind of racism of the other. And now the racism we get is slightly more upmarket because we're becoming a bit more middle class. We're becoming a little bit more prominent in public life. You have this amazing podcast. We have people in positions of political power, people in the corporate authorities. We are integrating and becoming part of the structure and becoming more visible. So we attract the racism that is now more existential. So now, if you think about the riots or what motivated the riots, it's this idea that we are taking over as such, that our faith is becoming popular. More people have converted to Islam in the last couple of years, even more so after Gaza. I mean, the numbers are difficult to quantify, but at least anecdotally, you can see this. There is a power in the message, and that means that we're attracting this existential angst from the majority or whatever the white community is, which is a bit like what I think our Jewish cousins have had to face for a long time, that with success breeds a resentment. So there is an evolution in some of the trends that we're facing. That in and of itself, weirdly enough, is a sign of success to some degree, right? The racism I will attract will be a different nature, that when this podcast goes out, people will send me emails about how terrible I am. But that, my grandfather never got that because he wasn't able to be public or have a voice in that sense. He was just a labourer that was taking someone's job. So in some senses, this is a byproduct of the fact that I think we're doing okay. That I think that because we're visible and because we're vocal and because people understand that maybe Islam is is kind of becoming everywhere, or by osmosis, or they're seeing it around. And you can argue whether it's a shallow or substantive version of Islam, but it is there. Maybe that is triggering something existential in people that means that we have to face more of it. So in some senses, I'm really bullish. I have to confine myself to the fact that I think I'm talking about Britain really and kind of the Anglo world. I couldn't probably say the same for like my brothers and sisters in France, where I think the lived reality of their lives, the hostile environments that are created for them, and their real difficulties in mobilizing in the way that we can potentially in the UK, it's much harder for them. So I wouldn't extend a lot of my diagnosis to other parts of Europe where I think it's much, much harder, because their Muslimness in and of itself is being something that is being criminalized. And so I think we should show a lot more solidarity, and I think we should understand a lot more what's happening in these countries that are very close to us. I mean, we all go on holiday in Europe. There are Muslims in these countries, and they really face political angst that we don't have here. So that's not to be complacent about what's happening in Britain, but I think it's worth just pointing out the differences, because there are some places where our brothers and sisters have it much worse than we do. But overall, I'm always going to be choosing to be more optimistic than not.
Mehreen Khan, I think that was a really great conversation. Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for your time.
Jazakallah.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkinmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.